"Old man, these things died a long time ago. If you want to put on a show, at least do it properly," Ryan Cole sneered, pointing straight at Thomas Ward in front of the dust-covered A-10 hangar, where the aircraft were labeled non-operational like death certificates. A clean joke. By the book. An old veteran turned into entertainment, and Cole was certain he was standing on the winning side. But just a few seconds later, just one very brief moment, the APU began to spin. No alarm sirens, no suppression systems. Then one main engine came into rhythm, steady and solid. The laughter died instantly. The air inside the hangar froze. Thomas said nothing. He simply climbed into the cockpit, as if that place had never been declared dead. And when the A-10 engine roared, every lie was torn apart. Colonel Ellen Moore rushed onto the runway. He did not ask how it could fly. He looked at the man in the cockpit and went completely still. The man called the old repair guy was not an anonymous veteran. He was General Thomas Ward. If you were Ryan Cole, what would you do when your joke awakens a legend? Stay silent to survive, or stand up against a system of abuse of power? Subscribe to the channel and comment A10, because this truth is not meant for those who choose to bow their heads. Gray Mesa lay in the middle of the New Mexico desert, where hot winds swept across rows of motionless metal, as if passing through a graveyard without headstones. This base was not built to prepare for war, but to process the surplus of history. On paper, the last A-10 Thunderbolt, 2 aircraft had already been pronounced dead, transferred into the category of no longer combat capable. They did not need to be shot down. A single system update was enough to turn them into memories. At Gray Mesa, the truth does not disappear. It is locked away, neatly arranged, and then labeled. That morning, sunlight slanted through the hangars, reflecting off the thick layers of dust coating the A-10 aircraft lined up in rows. On each landing gear frame, a white plastic placard was carefully attached, printed with the words, "Non-operational," like a death certificate pasted onto a forehead. There was no ceremony, no moment of silence, only the sound of footsteps and the beeping of barcode scanners. Ryan Cole stood before a group of young officers and technicians, holding a digital inspection tablet. He spoke clearly, his voice steady and emotionless. "Toda, we clean up the inventory. The objective is to complete the archive review according to the approved plan. Do not romanticize scrap metal." A few nods answered him. To them, this was a normal shift, just another step in a chain of procedures they trusted. Thomas Ward appeared at the end of the line, blending into the technical crew like an unremarkable piece of the puzzle. He wore simple work clothes, carried an old tool bag, no rank insignia, no patches. No one introduced him. No one asked further questions. At Gray Mesa, people without names were usually considered harmless. Anyone looking at him assumed he was an old maintenance soldier, hired on a short-term contract to deal with leftover, very trivial tasks. Cole glanced through the personnel list, his eyes pausing for a brief beat when he saw the name, Thomas. He looked up and asked directly, "What is your name?" Thomas answered shortly, "Thomas, I do maintenance." Not one word more. Cole nodded, acknowledging it the way one marks an item in storage. The exchange ended there. The line of 10 aircraft stretched out before them. A young technician slowed his pace as he passed Thomas, lowering his voice so only the two of them could hear. This old guy used to work on A-10 aircraft, or so they say. Thomas did not turn his head. He kept walking, his eyes gliding over each fuselage as if reading a familiar text. Cole heard the whisper, turned over, and smiled thinly. "Around here, hearsay has no value, only forms." His voice was not loud, but it was enough to extinguish any remaining curiosity. They stopped in front of an A-10 positioned at the end of the row. The paint was faded, and old scratches were still visible beneath the dust. Thomas stood before the fuselage and placed his hand on the cold metal. He spoke softly, not addressing anyone in particular. On paper, dead. In reality, not necessarily. Cole turned toward him, his gaze growing cold. "Are you here to philosophize?" Thomas did not answer. He simply withdrew his hand and stood straight, like a worker accustomed to being ignored. The inspection continued. Cole led the group through each checklist item, his voice as even as someone reading a manual. Airframe stable, electrical system sealed, no activity. Each statement was a stamp pressed onto the fate of the aircraft. Thomas followed behind, listening, memorizing. He did not interrupt, did not correct, did not object. At Gray Mesa, objection was a form of unnecessary noise. When the group paused in front of the internal records screen positioned at the center of the hangar, Cole requested the final status update. A technician operated the system, lines of data scrolling rapidly past. Thomas stood behind, looking at the screen. His gaze halted. Among the list of approval signatures, one line appeared clearly: authorized signature T. Ward. There was no unusual date or time, no warning flags. Everything looked perfect, clean, legitimate. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He did not speak. In that moment, he understood why he was there. His name had been used to legitimize the reclassification of the A-10, turning a technical decision into symbolic consent. There was no need to meet him, no need for a handwritten signature. Prolonged silence was enough. Cole looked at the screen, paying no attention to the reaction behind him. He concluded the inspection in a decisive tone. Gray Mesa exists to bury the past neatly. We carry no emotional responsibility for things that have reached the end of their life cycle. A few people took notes. A few nodded. The procedure closed as smoothly as it had begun, without a ripple. Thomas stepped back, his eyes still fixed on the line bearing his name. In his mind, old memories did not surge chaotically. They surfaced clearly, in order, like safety checklists that had once saved his life and the lives of others. He knew he could not speak yet. At Gray Mesa, speaking too early meant being removed from the game. He turned away, blending back into the flow of people leaving the hangar. On the screen, the words, authorized signature, remained illuminated, silent like a challenge. Thomas understood that his name had gone ahead of him, and that Gray Mesa was only the beginning. The archive inspection continued like a procedure that had been rehearsed many times. The young officers stood in a semicircle in front of the dust-covered A-10 row, notepads in hand, eyes waiting for the next instruction. Ryan Cole stepped forward, his voice carrying that familiar confidence of someone who always stands on the right side of duty and promotion. At Gray Mesa, everything had its place, and Cole believed he understood exactly where every person in this room belonged. He stopped, turned, and pointed straight at Thomas. I hear you used to be involved with A-10. The question was dropped like bait, loud enough for the whole group to hear. Thomas looked up and nodded, a brief gesture, with no explanation. A few pairs of eyes immediately locked onto him, mixed with curiosity and suspicion. To them, that nod was not confirmation of experience, but an out-of-place detail in the middle of a cold review. Cole curled his lip and raised his voice. So let's do it for fun. Start one up. The room stalled for a short beat. Then he added, his tone emphasized, enough to turn the line into a group joke. Oh, right. These things are dead already. A few laughs broke out, not loud, but unmistakable. It was the kind of safe laughter that wasn't aimed at any one person in particular, only at a concept the system had permitted them to look down on. A young officer in the back row edged forward half a step and raised a hand. Captain Cole snapped around and cut him off. Shut up. This is a lesson. His voice wasn't loud, but it was final. A lesson about order, about who gets to ask questions and who does not. The group fell silent again. Thomas stood still, his expression calm, as if what was happening had nothing to do with him. Cole moved closer, lowering his voice so only Thomas could hear. Old man, your time is over. Here, there's only the system. The air carried a faint smell of old metal and machine oil. Thomas looked straight at Cole, showing none of the reaction he wanted. That calm bothered Cole more than any pushback. He took a step back, folded his arms, like a theater-goer settling in. Let's see how far you can perform. Thomas bent down beside the nearest A-10. He set his tool bag on the floor, unlatched it, and gave it a quick visual check. Every motion was familiar, no rush, no hesitation. He touched the basic inspection points, moving through a sequence, etched deep into memory. The young officers watched, first curious, then confused. They realized he wasn't doing it in a showy way, but in the rhythm of someone who had been doing this for a very long time. Cole watched, his gaze sharpening. You know perfectly well those systems have been sealed. Thomas answered evenly. Sealed doesn't mean unsafe. A young technician frowned, as if he wanted to say something, then stopped. No one wanted to be the one who broke the atmosphere Cole had built. Thomas continued. He checked the auxiliary switches, silently read off the parameters, and adjusted the positions to the standard. Every movement had a reason. Every step was placed exactly where it belonged. Cole let out a short, provocative laugh. You're acting like this one still has a mission. Thomas didn't look up. I'm acting like it's still an aircraft. A few officers traded looks. They were starting to feel like this joke was going on longer than expected. Cole noticed it and spoke up, his voice harder. Make it clear this is only a demonstration. Nothing is to be actually activated. Thomas paused for a beat and looked up. I know the line. The answer made Cole hesitate for an instant. He didn't like the way Thomas said it, as if that line had once been drawn by Thomas himself. Thomas turned back to the control panel. He checked the auxiliary power and confirmed the safety conditions around him. No one ordered him to stop. No warning sounded. Everything unfolded in a gray zone that the system couldn't be bothered to interfere with. Cole tightened his folded arms, eyes fixed. Go on. Then, show everyone. There was a challenge in his voice, and a desire to watch that old man fail. The moment the APU began to spool, the sound was soft, but distinct, spreading through the wide hangar. The auxiliary engine starting up wasn't loud, but it was enough for anyone familiar with it to recognize it immediately. A technician jolted and turned to a coworker. That he didn't finish the sentence. The laughter was gone. The air turned thick. Cole stepped forward one pace, the joking look gone from his eyes. Who authorized this? No one answered. The system gave no blocking signal, no alarm siren, only the steady, stable APU sound like a heartbeat that had just been awakened. Thomas stood still, his hand still on the panel, eyes focused. He didn't look at Cole, and he didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the aircraft, as if confirming a truth he had known all along. That sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to crack the solid wall Cole trusted. He felt a chill run down his spine. The clean little joke, perfectly by the book, had just crossed a line he never expected. Right in front of them, something that had been declared dead had just opened its eyes, and no one in this room could say it should not have happened. The sound of the APU had stabilized, steady and solid, as if it had never been declared something that no longer existed. Then the main engine fell into rhythm, not roaring, not showing off, just a motion so smooth that it made the entire hangar sink into a state of held breath. The air inside the hangar changed noticeably. The murmurs disappeared, replaced by a taut sensation, as if someone had just pulled tight an invisible wire around the necks of everyone present. Ryan Cole sensed it faster than the others. The initial smile vanished from his face. Cole stepped forward, his voice dropping, carrying suppressed irritation. See, it runs, but it's just luck. He said it loudly, as if to reassure himself that control was still in his hands. Thomas Ward stood by the control panel and did not respond. He did not turn his head, nor did he change his working rhythm. That silence irritated Cole more than any argument. He pointed straight at Thomas, his voice rising. You're just a self-taught old man. Don't think these little tricks make you an expert. A few young officers flinched slightly, their eyes darting quickly between the two men, unsure which side to take, or more precisely, afraid to take any side at all. Thomas looked up, his gaze calm. He did not argue, nor did he explain. Instead, he asked a short question, his tone even, precise enough to make those with expertise pay attention. What mode is the auxiliary fuel cut system currently set to? The question was concise, exact, purely technical, yet it carried a risk that everyone understood. The space seemed to freeze. Two technicians standing nearby went pale, exchanging a glance. One opened his mouth, then closed it. No one answered. They knew that question was not meant for an ordinary maintenance worker. It was meant for someone who had lived through situations where a small deviation was enough to cost lives. The silence spread, thick and heavy. Cole noticed the change in the crowd's eyes. He immediately spoke up, his voice sharp and domineering. Don't pretend you understand. You don't have modern credentials to talk about these things. The words were like a blade, cutting off any chance of Thomas being taken seriously. To Cole, authority lay in records, in up-to-date certificates, in things that were printed and properly archived. Thomas did not argue. He bent down, opened his tool bag, and slowly took out a small notebook. The cover was worn, and the edges of the pages darkened to a deep yellow with time. He opened it, flipped through a few pages, dense handwritten lines appearing, crowded together, accompanied by symbols familiar to those who had worked directly with the A-10. He held the notebook up at chest level, not to show off, only so that those closest could see. Cole glanced at it and let out a short laugh, dry and sharp. That thing is outdated. He said it as if he had just pronounced the fate of an entire era. Here, we use digital data. No one works with old notebooks anymore. Thomas looked straight at Cole. His voice was low and slow, each word placed exactly where it belonged. This notebook records the times the system reacted differently from the reports, things that never appear in the summaries. A young officer swallowed lightly. He stepped closer, glanced at the open page, then immediately turned away, as if afraid of Cole's gaze. Cole frowned. "What are you implying?" Thomas replied, still keeping his tone even. "I am talking about reality." The answer made Cole clench his jaw. He felt that the initial joke had gone beyond his control. The technical questions, the old notebook, the reactions of the technicians, all of it combined into something he did not like: doubt. A technician standing at the edge of the group stepped forward half a pace. Looking at the notebook once more, he recognized that the recorded parameters matched the A10 running in front of them. Every small detail, every adjustment that only someone who had faced it directly could have written down. His throat went dry. He remained silent, but his eyes had changed. Cole noticed. He shouted, trying to regain control. "Enough. This is not a history discussion. Put that notebook down." Thomas did not comply immediately. He turned another page, pointed to a line, then looked toward the technicians. "This page talks about a similar situation." No further explanation was needed. Those who understood enough. The tension spread like a wave. Cole felt himself being pushed into a defensive position by his own subordinates. He stepped forward, his voice low but heavy. "You are disrupting order." Thomas replied with a short sentence. "I am reminding it." The words made a few people nearby subtly shift their stance, as if they had just heard something they had once thought but never dared to say. Cole sneered, trying to appear contemptuous. "This order does not need old notebooks to exist." Thomas closed the notebook and held it in his hand. "But it needs truth in order not to collapse." A long pause followed. The steady engine sound behind them became the only background noise. A technician swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the notebook. He realized that those notes were not only correct, but also accurately predicted the current state of the A10. In his mind, the joke had completely changed shape. It was no longer a demonstration, but a warning. Cole turned away, as if to end the confrontation, but unease had already latched onto him. The yellowed notebook in Thomas's hand did not just contain data, it contained a history the system had tried to erase, and at this very moment, that history was breathing, running, emitting a steady sound in the middle of Gray Mesa. If you want to see the notebook turn this joke into a real nightmare for Ryan Cole, follow and comment on Notebook, because in the next step, the truth will roar. Thomas Ward slowly folded his notebook shut. The gesture did not resemble an ending. It was more like putting away a piece of evidence that had already been fully presented. He slipped the notebook into his work jacket pocket, pressing it close to his chest, as if storing a verdict, not yet ready to be read aloud. Around him, the air remained taut, like a drawn string. The steady hum of engines behind them formed an unpleasant background noise, reminding everyone that something was operating beyond familiar control. Thomas turned and walked toward the cockpit. The distance was not far, yet each step seemed longer than usual, weighed down by the eyes of the entire group following him. Ryan Cole noticed immediately. He stepped forward half a pace, his voice sharper and higher than before. "Stop. You are not allowed up there." The words rang out clearly, carrying the authority Cole was accustomed to using to lock down any situation. Thomas did not turn around. He kept moving. No one pressed an alarm button. No emergency chime sounded from the security system. No hand reached out to grab his shoulder and pull him back. The system's indifference revealed itself with frightening clarity. It did not permit the action, but it did not prevent it either. It allowed everything to drift in a gray zone of responsibility. Cole snapped around to his subordinates, fury in his eyes. "I said stop. Did you hear me?" He waited for a reaction, a nod, a confirming motion. What answered him was silence. The young officers stood still, their gazes averted. No one wanted to be the first to intervene in a situation that had become difficult to define. They understood that if they pulled Thomas back, they would have to explain, and if they explained, they would have to put their names on it. Thomas stepped onto the ladder, leading into the cockpit. His hand settled on the metal rail, firm and familiar. Every movement was precise, like a reflex, honed under far harsher conditions. He was not in a hurry, but he did not hesitate either. To him, the cockpit was not forbidden territory, but a place where every question had a concrete answer. Cole clenched his teeth and stepped forward another pace, his voice lowered but heavy. "Who do you think you are? Acting like this is your home." The sentence carried both irritation and a vague fear. Thomas paused for a very brief beat, then turned to look at Cole. His gaze was neither harsh nor defiant. It was calm to the point of being unsettling. Thomas replied, his voice low, each word clear. "The one who knows the truth." The answer dropped like a heavy object. No one laughed. No one spoke. Thomas turned back and stepped fully into the cockpit. The door closed behind him, cutting him off from the crowd outside. Inside, the familiar cramped space greeted him with the smell of metal and engine oil. He sat down in the seat, placed his hands on the control panel, and quickly checked each parameter, each position. Everything was exactly as he had predicted, exactly as recorded in the old notebook. Outside, Cole stood frozen. He felt his authority eroding right before his eyes, not through an act of open defiance, but through the cold, fluid progression of technically legitimate actions. He turned to a technician, his voice urgent. "Who authorized this?" The man lowered his head and answered quietly. The system did not block it. That simple response left Cole with nothing to grasp onto to continue. Thomas began operating the controls. The switches were flipped in the precise sequence. The indicators responded on cue. The main engine's sound shifted from steady to more powerful, like a living being fully awakened. The noise poured out of the cockpit, slammed against the hangar walls, spread farther, cutting through a space long accustomed to the silence of things that had been decommissioned. Engine A-10 roared. The sound was unlike that of ordinary machinery. It carried the compression of truth, like a lie being torn apart in front of a crowd. Several officers flinched and instinctively stepped back. Cole felt his chest tighten. This was no longer a clean joke. This was an action he could not label, could not process with forms. The roar did not remain confined to the hangar. It spilled outward, ran along the runway, and past the operations buildings. In another part of the base, Colonel Ellen Moore was reviewing reports when he paused. He looked up and listened. The familiar yet alien sound made him frown. He sprang to his feet, moved quickly to the door, and asked the duty officer, "Where is that sound coming from?" The man shook his head, confused. "Sir, the system shows no alarm." Ellen Moore stopped for a brief moment, then spoke as if to himself. "Impossible. No, A-10 should be running." He did not wait for an answer. The instinct of someone who had commanded long enough told him that something was happening beyond what was recorded on the screens. He turned and headed briskly toward the runway, while the sound continued to ring out, clear and undeniable. Back in the hangar, Cole stood motionless. He looked at the A-10 coming back to life before his eyes and understood that from this moment on, nothing could return to its original state. The system had opened the way through its own indifference, and Thomas Ward had stepped through that door without asking permission, without arguing, simply by doing what needed to be done. Ellen Moore stepped out of the operations area while the sound had not yet faded. The desert wind swept past, carrying the echo of the engine clear, steady, unmistakable. He did not need to ask any further questions. The way the sound spread, the way it held a consistent rhythm, all told him this was not interference, nor a margin of error. He turned sharply toward the runway, his stride decisive, his mind already pushing aside every convenient hypothesis. The A-10 came into view just as Ellen Moore reached the edge of the runway. It slid in, perfectly aligned, touching down cleanly like a maneuver practiced hundreds of times. There was no sign of wobble, no indication of something that could be called no longer combat capable. In that moment, everything written on paper suddenly became meaningless. He stood still, his eyes tracking every meter of runway being consumed beneath the landing gear, until the aircraft decelerated and came to a textbook stop. Behind him, Ryan Cole stood frozen. His mouth hung open as if he wanted to say something, but no sound came out. Every phrase he had used earlier to control the situation vanished. The young officers around him were the same. Their eyes were locked onto the A-10 sitting there, as if they were looking at something that was not supposed to exist. The joke from moments before had dissolved, leaving behind a cold void. The cockpit canopy opened. Thomas Ward stepped down, one slow step at a time. Calm, unshowy, he touched the ground and stood upright, as if he had just completed a routine mission. Desert dust clung to his boots, but he paid it no mind. He looked straight ahead, toward where Ellen Moore was standing, his expression composed, not waiting for approval. Ellen Moore stiffened. The first instant was surprise, the natural reflex of someone witnessing something that contradicted every report. The next instant, his gaze hardened, sharp, as when facing a truth that had to be dealt with immediately. He looked closer, recognizing the posture, recognizing the way Thomas kept his distance from the aircraft, recognizing a composure that could not be faked. He murmured, his voice dropping, "No, it can't be." The sound was quiet enough that no one but him heard it, but the change on his face needed no explanation. The air around the runway seemed to freeze. No one applauded, no one cheered, no one dared whisper. The people standing there understood that they were witnessing a moment beyond their authority. Ellen Moore stepped forward one pace, positioning himself between Thomas and the crowd. He did not look at Ryan Cole, nor at the A-10. He looked straight at the group of officers and technicians, his voice low, clear, sharp as a blade. "All of you, stand at attention. The order rang out without emphasis, yet carried the full weight of rank and responsibility. Reflex took over instantly. Arms shot up, movements hurried and uneven, like a belated act of self-defense. Ryan Cole followed, half a beat, slower, his face drained of color. In his mind, every word he had spoken earlier came rushing back, one by one. No longer a joke this time. He looked at Thomas, then at Ellen Moore, trying to reconcile two images that should never have appeared together. Sweat ran down his spine. Ice cold, Ellen Moore turned to Thomas. His gaze rested on a familiar face he had not seen in many years. For a brief moment, he seemed to weigh something, then bypassed all intermediate formalities. He stood straight, his voice firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Greetings, General." The command cut through the space like a blade. The raised arms stiffened, then adjusted into proper form. A series of salutes was executed in disciplined panic. Ryan Cole felt his throat go dry. He realized he was saluting the man he had just called a washed-up old mechanic. The contrast struck him head-on, allowing no escape. Thomas Ward did not respond immediately. He stood still in the middle of the runway, letting the order ripple outward, letting the system confront its own contradiction. His eyes swept over the crowd, no reproach, no satisfaction. He simply took note. Then he looked back at Ellen Moore and gave a slight nod, a proper gesture, measured and sufficient. Ellen Moore lowered his hand and signaled for everyone to hold their positions. He stepped forward one more pace, his voice lower but still clear. "General Ward, can you explain why this A-10 is on my runway?" The question was not technical. It was confirmatory. Ellen Moore was not asking how it could fly. He was asking why this had been concealed. Thomas answered, his voice steady. "Colonel, this one was never dead." The reply was brief, but it struck the core of the issue. Several technicians swallowed hard. They understood that what they had just witnessed would not end here. Ryan Cole tried to recover his voice and stepped forward half a pace. "Colonel, this is an unforeseen situation." Ellen Moore turned to him, his gaze cold. Unforeseen by whom? Cole fell silent. The question required no answer. The desert wind swept across the runway, carrying the smell of fuel and dust. The A-10 stood there, silent, like living evidence. Ellen Moore looked around, meeting the eyes of every person standing before him. He understood that from this moment on, Gray Mesa was no longer a safe place to hide the past. Everything had been exposed under the sunlight, clear and undeniable. A row of arms remained raised, holding their salutes in mounting tension. Ryan Cole stood among them, his face ashen, fully aware that the image of the old mechanic had completely collapsed. Before him, General Thomas Ward stood in the middle of the runway like a living sentence, unspoken, unexplained, yet sufficient to reshape everything that would follow. Ellen Moore did not linger on the runway. He turned the moment the A-10 came to a full stop and moved quickly toward the operations center, his gaze already shifting from incident handling to tracing the cause. For him, the question of how the aircraft flew no longer mattered. What mattered was why everything had been allowed to happen that way. When the door to the operations room closed, Ellen Moore placed his hand on the table, his voice striking straight into the enclosed space. "Reopen the entire approval file from 6 months ago." Now, a legal officer hurriedly worked the large screen. Data appeared in layers, timelines, electronic signatures, confirmation lines neatly arranged. Ellen Moore stood watching, saying nothing more. Thomas Ward stood beside him, silent, his eyes fixed on the familiar lines of text. Ryan Cole stood half a step back, with the feeling that he was on the wrong side of the room. The screen stopped at the final approval page. One line stood out, clear and valid. Authorized signature Thomas Ward. No annotation, no request for additional confirmation. Ellen Moore leaned closer, looking more carefully. "No need to meet him. No handwritten signature," he said, his voice dropping. One officer stammered, "Colonel, this is retained signing authority. It applies to retired commanders. If there is no objection within the prescribed time frame." Ellen Moore cut him off, his voice icy. "Silence is not consent. Who taught you to turn it into consent?" The question fell without waiting for an answer. In the room, several people lowered their heads. They knew the rule existed, and they also knew why it was convenient. It allowed the system to keep moving without having to face those who once had the authority to ask questions. Thomas spoke up, his voice low and steady. "My name was used to legitimize the reclassification." He did not need to explain further. The line on the screen had already done that for him. Ellen Moore gave a slight nod, then signaled to move to the next page. Next, the planning page appeared. Schedule, destinations, receiving partners. Ellen Moore read aloud, one word at a time. Transferred to a defense contractor under the guise of analysis. He looked up, scanning the room, Analysis of what a technician swallowed and answered quietly. Colonel, strictly speaking, dissection, dismantling. No one objected to that statement. It was far too familiar to argue with. Ellen Moore slammed his hand down on the table. The dry sound cut through the air. Once dismantled, there will be no intact Aten left for comparison. Only reports and conclusions written in advance. He looked directly at the legal officer. Correct. The man nodded, reluctantly. Correct, Colonel. Thomas looked at the transfer schedule. The milestones were marked tightly together, leaving no gaps. They left no time for any independent assessment. Ellen Moore replied immediately, because they do not want an assessment. Ryan Cole swallowed, trying to speak. Colonel, this plan has been fully approved. Ellen Moore turned to him. Fully approved by whose standards? Cole fell silent. In his mind, everything began to rearrange itself into a new order. The initial joke, the notebook, the electronic signature, the transfer schedule, none of it was a random chain of events. They were links in a process that had been running smoothly for far too long. He realized he was standing in exactly the right position for that process to pass through, and also the most convenient position to bear the consequences if something went wrong. Ellen Moore ordered the conclusion page opened. The text appeared, neat and decisive. The Aten is obsolete, elimination is necessary, and the veteran commanders have consented. Ellen Moore read slowly, his voice growing hoarse on the final word. He looked up at Thomas. Consent, Thomas replied without hesitation. Through silence, the answer made the room heavier. Another officer tried to keep a neutral tone. Colonel, this is the standard procedure for handling assets that have reached the end of their life cycle. Ellen Moore looked at him sharply. Who defines the life cycle? No one answered. Ellen Moore turned back to the planning board and pointed to the nearest transfer milestone. How long? 48 hours. Ellen Moore nodded, then spoke as if issuing an order to the system itself. Stop. Thomas placed his hand on the table and spoke slowly. Gray Mesa does not just store, it is the final transit point. Ellen Moore followed his hand to where arrows on the diagram led from the warehouse to the transport area. Then, out of the base. Once it leaves here, all physical evidence will disappear, Ellen Moore replied, and only reports will remain. He turned to Cole. Do you understand what is happening? Cole nodded slowly. They are erasing real-world data to protect a conclusion. Ellen Moore did not deny it. He looked back at the electronic signature bearing Thomas Ward's name. They need his name to clean everything up, Thomas added, and they need me to stay silent. No one argued. The truth was already too clear. Ellen Moore signaled for everyone to leave the room, keeping only a few key people behind. When the door closed, he spoke more quietly, but each word was heavy. From now on, every move will be monitored, Thomas replied. I know. Ellen Moore looked straight at him. They will not stop at paperwork. Thomas nodded. I know that too. Ryan Cole stood at the doorway, hesitating. Ellen Moore called him back. You stay. Cole turned around, his heart pounding. Ellen Moore spoke plainly. On paper, you are the one in charge of Gray Mesa. If anything happens, your name will be at the top. Cole swallowed. Colonel. Ellen Moore cut him off. You have a choice, but that choice will not be safe. Cole looked at Thomas, then, at the signature line on the screen. He understood that the safety he had once trusted had been bought with someone else's silence. Ellen Moore turned back to the screen and read the conclusion once more, slowly. The Aten is obsolete, elimination is necessary, and the veteran commanders have consented. He turned off the screen. In the darkened room, only the emergency lights reflected on everyone's faces. Ellen Moore spoke, his voice low but clear. If someone wants to turn this into a clean sentence, they will have to do more than borrow a signature. He looked at Thomas, and if they want to silence you, they will start soon. Thomas nodded. He knew it. Gray Mesa had just revealed itself not as a place to bury the past, but as a gateway to erase it from the present. If you want to know who is behind this clean sentence, and why they need to silence Thomas Ward, keep following because from here on, the story is no longer a joke, but a purge. After the truth at Gray Mesa was exposed, the base slipped into a strange state. There were no alarms, no public lockdown orders, yet every movement slowed, became more cautious. Conversations stopped halfway when an unfamiliar person entered. Files were locked in layers, not to protect them, but to control them. It was a deliberate silence, the silence of a system that had just realized something was slipping beyond its grasp and was now looking for a way to tighten its hold. Ellen Moore was in his office when the call came in. The screen displayed a connection code with no attached name. He picked up without hesitation. The voice on the other end came through steady, cold, requiring no introduction. Colonel, "You are digging too deep." The sentence was not a warning, but sounded more like a carefully considered assessment. Ellen Moore leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed straight ahead. "I am fulfilling my duty," he replied, his voice not raised, but firm. On the other end of the line, a soft laugh sounded, brief, just enough to convey understanding. "Duty is a flexible thing," the voice continued, as if explaining an unspoken rule Ellen Moore should have learned long ago. Thomas Ward stood beside the desk, hearing every word clearly. He did not look at Ellen Moore, nor at the screen. He stared into the space ahead, where years of service had taught him how to sense danger before it took shape. The way that voice did not need to name itself, the way it spoke of duty as something that could be bent, all of it was familiar to him. The call ended without a goodbye. Ellen Moore set the receiver down and remained silent for several seconds. Then he stood and walked toward the caseboard mounted on the wall. "Maintain all internal data as is," he told the duty officer. "No one edits or copies anything without my authorization." The officer nodded, though a flicker of unease crossed his eyes. A legal officer entered, holding a tablet. "Colonel, I have just reviewed the approval chain for the Grey Mesa plan." Ellen Moore turned back, and, the officer swallowed, the plan was approved from very high up, not at the base level, not at the regional level. Ellen Moore looked straight at him. "Who?" The question was short. No answer was given. The legal officer stood still, lips pressed tight. That silence said more than any name could. It marked the boundary of what was allowed to be spoken. Thomas spoke, his voice low, as if to avoid shattering the tension in the room. "The one behind this does not need to appear." Ellen Moore turned toward him. "You think so?" Thomas nodded. "If he appeared, he would leave traces. He paused. "This is structure." Ellen Moore understood. This was not a mistaken decision by a few individuals. It had been designed to operate smoothly, with enough buffers that no one would have to bear direct responsibility. Everyone did their assigned part, and the outcome emerged as something inevitable. A notification chimed from the computer on the desk. Ellen Moore glanced over. A new email had just been pushed into the internal system, marked high priority. The subject line was short, cold, reassessment of the psychological fitness of Thomas Ward. Ellen Moore frowned and opened it. The content was written in standardized language, with no accusations, no charges, only recommendations, only concern. Thomas stepped closer, reading over his shoulder. He let out a quiet breath, slow and controlled. "Their next move is to silence me," he said, without surprise in his tone. Ellen Moore looked at him. "They are using medicine," Thomas replied. "The cleanest method." Ellen Moore struck the desk lightly with his hand. "You have done nothing wrong." Thomas turned to him. "That does not matter," he continued. "What matters is that I make them uncomfortable." Ellen Moore fell silent. He knew it was true. In many years of service, he had seen enough cases where the truth itself became a problem, simply because it did not align with a pre-selected direction. Ryan Cole stood in the hallway outside, catching fragments of the new orders being passed along. Grey Mesa was being closed down differently, not with barriers, but with procedures. He looked at his work screen and saw access rights gradually being restricted. Some folders he had once managed now required additional authentication. It made him realize he was standing in a more dangerous position than he had imagined. Inside the room, Ellen Moore turned back to Thomas. "They will not stop here." Thomas nodded. "I know." Ellen Moore continued. "Are you ready?" Thomas looked at him, his gaze calm. "I have been ready since the moment they used my name." Another officer entered with a quiet report. "Colonel, higher command is requesting a situation update today." Ellen Moore replied. "I will respond." When the officer left, Ellen Moore turned back to Thomas. "From now on, everything you say and do can be interpreted." Thomas smiled faintly. "Then I will speak less and act more precisely." Ellen Moore leaned against the desk, thinking quickly. He understood that this confrontation had no clear shape. No enemy was standing in front of them. Only words, phone calls, and emails sent at exactly the right time. Power did not need a signature, because it was already embedded in the way the system had been built. Thomas looked again at the email. Those cold sentences did not mention achievements, did not mention experience. They targeted only one thing, suitability. He understood the message beneath it. Once labeled unsuitable, every word he spoke would lose its value. He looked up and spoke to Ellen Moore, his voice low but steady. "They think I will react?" Ellen Moore asked. "And what will you do?" Thomas answered after a brief pause. "I will stay." The answer made Ellen Moore study him more closely. Staying inside a system, preparing to eliminate I'm was not a safe choice. But Ellen Moore understood that it was also the only choice if the truth was not to be suffocated in silence. Out in the hallway, Ryan Cole stood looking through the glass, seeing the two men exchange short, heavy sentences. He could not hear the content, but he felt the pressure. For the first time, Cole understood that his joke had opened something far beyond personal control, and if the system began searching for obstacles to remove, he was standing very close to that position as well. Inside the room, Ellen Moore returned to his desk, opened a new file, and marked it highly classified. "We need to prepare," he said. Thomas nodded. "They will move quickly," Ellen Moore replied, "and cleanly." Thomas looked at the screen, where the email still glowed. He drew a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. "Their next move is to silence me," he said again, this time not as a prediction, but as a confirmation. Gray Mesa had entered a different phase, no longer a place to bury the past, but a chessboard where invisible power began moving real pieces. The counteroffensive began quietly. There were no accusations, no arrest orders. What the system released instead was a familiar procedure, wrapped in the language of responsibility and care. A medical evaluation, combined with internal security, was activated at a speed that made everyone at Gray Mesa understand that the decision had been waiting, needing only a legitimate pretext to surface. The evaluation room was located in a secondary administrative wing, W&H with white lights, neat tables and chairs, lacking the appearance of an interrogation space. A military physician sat across from Thomas Ward, a thick file already opened in front of her. She read slowly, her voice even, as if presenting an objective report. Extended combat history, participation in multiple high-intensity operations, signs of fixation related to the A-10 aircraft. She looked up, observing his reaction. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she paused, he asked directly, his tone calm. "Have you ever flown an A-10? The question hung in the space between them. The doctor did not answer immediately. She closed the file halfway, then deflected. "I am evaluating according to medical standards." Thomas nodded. "Then you are evaluating something you have never experienced." The room fell silent for a brief beat. A security officer stood near the door, lowering his voice when he spoke. "General, this is just a procedure." The form of address was deliberately maintained, a way to reassure that Thomas's rank was still being respected. Thomas turned to look at him, his gaze steady. "A procedure to silence me." The security officer pressed his lips together, offering no rebuttal. He knew the statement struck the core of the matter. Ellen Moore stood at the back of the room, arms crossed. He stepped forward one pace. "He is completely lucid." His voice was firm, requiring no further justification. "I have worked with him for the past 2 days. The doctor glanced at Ellen Moore, then back to Thomas. "No one is saying he has lost control," she replied. "We are only assessing his suitability for participating in sensitive technical evaluations." A legal representative seated at the adjacent table interjected, his voice cold and precise. "No one is saying he is insane. He is simply no longer suitable for the current context." The wording was carefully chosen, non-insulting, yet sufficient to exclude. Thomas looked at him and asked slowly, "Suitable for whom?" The legal representative did not answer directly. "For the process." Ellen Moore clenched his jaw. "The process cannot stand above the truth." The legal representative turned to him. "The process exists to manage the truth." The air in the room thickened. The voices were not loud, but every word carried the weight of invisible authority. The doctor returned to the file and continued reading the pre-written notes. "Recommendation for temporary isolation from evaluation activities, to ensure safety for the individual and the system." Hearing this, Thomas understood that the conclusion had been shaped in advance. He did not interrupt. He allowed them to complete their task. A device on the table emitted a short tone. The legal representative glanced at the screen and nodded. "The internal holding order has been prepared. Administrative only." Ellen Moore stepped forward, his voice hard. "Held for what reason?" The legal representative replied, "Further evaluation." Ellen Moore shook his head. "This is isolation." Thomas turned to Ellen Moore. "Don't," he said it quietly, "only for the two of them to hear. They are waiting for you to object, so they can expand the scope." Ellen Moore stopped. He understood. Any strong reaction now would be recorded as additional evidence supporting the original argument. The security officer stepped forward, polite, but firm. "General, please come with us." Thomas stood up. He adjusted his posture and scanned the room once more. His gaze rested on the doctor, then on the legal representative, then on Ellen Moore. "You call this protecting the system," he said. "I call it isolating the truth." The doctor lowered her eyes. The legal representative's expression did not change. Ellen Moore remained still, his gaze darkening. Thomas walked toward the door, 2 security officers following behind him, keeping just enough distance to avoid turning it into a public escort. The corridor was long, with white lights stretching ahead, each footstep echoing softly. When the isolation room door closed behind Thomas, the sound of the locking mechanism rang out more clearly than any formal conclusion. He stood alone in the empty room, understanding that, from this moment on, every word he spoke outside would be labeled with a psychological status. The truth was not forbidden, it was placed in an inaccessible zone. Outside, Ellen Moore remained with a group of senior officers. Voices were lowered. "Where did this order come from?" someone asked. Another replied quietly, "From very high up." Ellen Moore pressed further. "Name?" No one answered immediately. A young security officer whispered, as if afraid of the name itself, "Victor Hale." Ellen Moore turned away, a chill running down his spine. That name did not appear on any organizational chart at Gray Mesa, but he knew that from this moment on, everything unfolding bore that man's mark. Victor Hale did not need to sign his name. He let the system work in his place. Inside the sealed room, Thomas Ward sat down and breathed slowly. He did not panic. He was accustomed to being placed at a disadvantage. What was different this time was the method. No confrontation, no accusation, just a gentle push to the margins, letting the truth fade on its own, at a safe distance. Outside, Gray Mesa continued to operate, orderly and silent, but a name had been spoken for the first time, quiet enough not to carry far, clear enough to be irreversible. Victor Hale. And from here on, the purge began under what would be called humane measures. Ryan Cole was summoned to the crisis processing room when it was already dark. The room was located deep within the administrative wing, softly lit, well soundproofed, the kind of space designed so that every decision made inside could exist without witnesses. On the table in front of him sat a computer that was already powered on, the internal inbox blinking continuously, each subject line appearing in a priority order, in which he had never seen his own name appear so many times. Cole read the first email. "Officer suitable to sign final confirmation." The wording was concise, neutral, with no explanation attached. He moved on to the next email, his heartbeat beginning to slip out of rhythm. In the event of escalation, responsibility lies with Cole. He stopped, read it again twice, to make sure he had not misunderstood. There was no mistake. His name was placed at the end of the chain, where all arrows ultimately pointed. He looked up at the superior seated across from him, a senior officer sent from the coordination division. "Why me?" Cole asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man did not avoid his gaze and answered briefly, "You were on site." Not one word more. None was needed. That answer was enough to close every possibility of objection. Cole leaned back in his chair. In his mind, the images on the runway returned with clarity, scattered laughter, the sentence he had tossed out, treating it as a harmless joke. Thomas Ward's gaze at that moment was calm to the point of irritation. Cole swallowed hard. He began to understand. He had not been chosen because he was capable, nor because he was loyal. He had been chosen because of his position, because he had been standing close enough to the incident to absorb all the remaining filth. Another email appeared. The transfer schedule for the A-10 to the defense contractor. Date and time. Transport. Receiving partner. Everything arranged neatly, leaving no visible gaps. Cole skimmed, then slowed when he saw the final signature field left blank. He understood the meaning of that space. If Thomas was detained, if everything continued according to the script, he would be the one to fill it. "They're using me as a shield," Cole whispered, low enough that only he could hear. The man across from him did not react. Perhaps he had heard that sentence from many others over the years. Cole felt a chill run down his spine. He realized he had never been the one in power. He was merely padding, placed precisely to absorb impact. The senior officer stood up. "Your task is to maintain stability," he said evenly. "No further action is required." Cole watched him, then asked, "And if there are questions from outside?" The man replied, "You are the signatory. You are responsible." The door closed behind him, leaving Cole alone with the glowing screen. Cole stared at the inbox. The cold lines of text carried no personal hostility. They operated like gears inside a machine far larger than himself. He recalled the moment Ellen Moore ordered the salute to the general on the runway. The silence then, the unspoken fear. Cole understood that from that moment, he had been pushed into this orbit. He reopened the email concerning Thomas, the psychological assessment language, the internal detention order, all presented as protective measures. Cole shook his head slightly. Protecting whom? Not Thomas, not the truth. Protecting a conclusion that had already been written, and the person who signed the final confirmation would be the one held accountable before the public if something went wrong. The internal phone vibrated softly. Cole picked it up. Cole speaking. The voice on the other end was low, familiar. "You've seen the emails," Cole replied. "Yes." The voice continued. "You understand what you need to do." Cole paused for a beat. I understand what they want me to do. The voice corrected him. And you will do it. Cole took a deep breath. If I don't. The line went silent for a moment, then answered, you will no longer be in this position. The call ended. Cole set the phone down and stared into the space. For the first time, he saw clearly the fragility of the position he had once believed was safe. Every promotion now appeared as a temporary reward, in exchange for silence when required. He stood up and walked to the window. Looking out, Gray Mesa lay quiet, lights stretching along the runway. The A-10 was out there somewhere, motionless, as if it had never roared. Cole remembered Thomas's words, spoken by someone who knew the truth. At the time, he had dismissed them as the bragging of an outdated veteran. Now those words returned, heavier. The truth did not need many defenders. It needed the right person standing in the right place, at the right time. And he was standing in a deeply uncomfortable place. He returned to the desk and opened the transfer schedule email once more. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. If he signed, everything would proceed smoothly. Thomas would be isolated. Gray Mesa would complete its mission, and he would keep his position, at least for a short while. If he did not sign, the system would find someone else, and he would become the next problem to be handled. Cole sat down and turned off the lights in the room, leaving only the glow of the screen. In the darkness, the lines of text appeared sharper. He whispered, this time without hesitation, silence is survival, but it is also death. The sentence was not philosophical. It was a simple calculation he was forced to make. He opened another folder, containing the entire history of internal communications related to Gray Mesa. Emails, approvals, indirect directives, things he had never paid attention to because he believed he did not need to. Cole began to read, line by line. The more he read, the more he understood that the situation had gone far beyond the scope of a single signature. A new notification popped up, reminding him of the response deadline. Cole did not dismiss it. He left it there, like a reminder that time was not on his side. Outside, Gray Mesa remained silent, but that silence was closing in. Cole stood up, put on his jacket, and stepped out of the room. The corridor was long, and the lights casting his shadow stretched across the floor. For the first time since taking the position, he was not sure where he was going, but he knew that if he continued to stand still, he would become exactly what they needed him to be, an anonymous shield, absorbing every impact, so the system would remain unscathed. He stopped at the doorway and looked back at the crisis processing room one last time. Inside, the screen was still glowing, waiting for his signature. Cole took a deep breath. The decision had not yet been made, but the choice had never been clearer. If you have ever been in a position where you had to choose between personal safety and the truth, keep following, because Ryan Cole is about to break the chain. Victor Hale did not appear at Gray Mesa. There was no meeting schedule, no visit, no order bearing his signature. Yet from the moment his name was whispered in the corridors, every movement began to synchronize frighteningly. What had previously been fragmented suddenly connected into a straight, seamless line, without any need for pressure. Ellen Moore saw this with absolute clarity. Real power does not need to stand in front of cameras. It only needs the system to operate in the correct rhythm. A legal aid reported in a closed room. Speaking cautiously, he has never directly signed anything here. Ellen Moore did not look up from the screen. And yet everything is going exactly according to his will, he replied, as if reading a conclusion already written. The aide fell silent. Both of them understood that Hale's fingerprints were in places that required no ink, in the transition points between procedures, where people believed they were acting fully within their authority. An anonymous call came through to Ellen Moore's phone. He picked it up. The voice on the other end did not introduce itself. The colonel should think about his career. The voice was even, not threatening, like well-intentioned advice. Ellen Moore leaned back in his chair. I am thinking about the truth, he replied. The line paused for a brief moment, then disconnected. No debate was necessary. The message had been delivered sufficiently. Elsewhere on the base, indirect orders began to filter downward. There was no document clearly bearing Hale's name, only carefully chosen phrasing. Prioritize stability, avoid media risk, protect procedure. A concise message passed through multiple layers of intermediaries, each layer understanding it in its own way, yet all converging on the same point. Remove Thomas. Leave no trace. Ellen Moore received the next update. The plan to escort Thomas was accelerated. The stated reasons were neatly recorded: schedule adjustment, security assurance. He read it, underlined a line, then looked up. Who requested the acceleration? The officer replied in a low voice. Directive from above. Ellen Moore asked again. Name. The officer shook his head. None. Thomas Ward was in the isolation room, sitting upright, his eyes fixed on space. He sensed the change before anyone said a word. The footsteps in the hallway became denser. Procedures moved faster, with less discussion. This was how the system worked when it wanted to end an issue cleanly. No argument required, only shortened time. Ryan Cole stood in the coordination room, watching the status board. A new milestone had just been added, adjusting the deadline. He read it, and immediately understood its meaning. When everything accelerated, responsibility was compressed to fall squarely on one person. He looked at the line related to media, status pending. That meant the story had already been written, merely waiting for the moment of release if necessary. Cole felt his throat go dry. Ellen Moore called Cole in. What do you see? Cole answered, more honest than ever. They're clearing the path. Ellen Moore nodded. And they don't want witnesses, Cole said. He understood that if Thomas was taken away, everything afterward would become crisis management. With Cole standing on the front line with his signature attached, another internal notice appeared. Military media channels were placed on standby, not to report, but to suppress. Ellen Moore looked at the notice, then shut off the screen. They've prepared for both scenarios, he said, either silence passing unnoticed or noise under control. Cole asked, and Thomas? Ellen Moore replied, he's the variable. In the isolation wing corridor, a security officer received a new order. He read it, confirmed, then adjusted his posture. The order was not long, just timing. Right now, he walked toward Thomas's room, carrying the rigid politeness of someone who knew he was performing a task that required no explanation. Ellen Moore stood before the base map, looking at the shortest route from the isolation room to the transport zone. He knew Hale would not appear to give a direct order. There was no need. Those below would understand their roles on their own. Hale disliked things that could not be controlled through reports. The A-10 was one. Thomas Ward was another. And when those two met, the system had to choose. Thomas heard the footsteps stop outside the door. He stood up and adjusted his posture. There was no need to guess. He had been waiting for this moment since the evaluation email appeared. The door opened. The security officer stepped in, maintaining the appropriate distance. General, please come with us. The voice was properly measured, as if inviting someone to leave a meeting room. Thomas looked at the officer, then glanced into the hallway. He asked, his voice low, where to? The officer replied, per security directive. Thomas nodded. He did not ask for further explanation. He understood that when the antagonist never appears, all dialogue becomes superfluous. Far away, Ryan Cole received the movement notification. He stood up, his heart racing. He knew he was standing at the final boundary. If he let the escort pass, everything would close. If he intervened, he would step into unsafe ground. He looked at his watch, then at the door. Thomas's time was running out, and at the same time, so was Cole's time to choose. Ellen Moore stepped into the corridor and stopped at a blind corner, where he could observe the security detail without drawing attention. He did not order them to stop. Not yet. He needed one more thing. One missing piece to turn the truth into something that could not be denied by reports. Hale was waiting for the system to complete its task. Ellen Moore was waiting for a deviation. The isolation room door closed behind Thomas. The security detail began to move. There was no noise, no dramatic scene. Everything unfolded cleanly, by the book, exactly the way invisible power preferred it, and because of that, it was more frightening than any public order. Victor Hale did not appear, but at Gray Mesa, every road was now leading toward his decision. Thomas's time was nearly over, and the game entered its final phase, where a single signature could decide a fate, and a single silence could become guilt. The security detail had just turned into the corridor leading to the transport area when Ryan Cole appeared from the opposite direction. He moved quickly but decisively, like someone who had already made his decision before taking action. The distance between the two sides was closed in a few steps. Cole raised his hand, his voice carrying enough force to make everyone stop. Wait. The word was short, without permission, without explanation. The security team halted on instinct, their gazes shifting from Thomas Ward to Cole, then to the commanding officer. The security officer frowned. Captain, this is procedure. Cole nodded, holding eye contact. I know. He stepped aside, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a thick file. The documents were not new, but they were neatly arranged and organized in order. Cole turned and handed the file directly to Ellen Moore, who had just arrived from behind. Directive emails, the A-10 transfer schedule, archival signature authority, he said, evenly. It's all here. Ellen Moore took it and quickly flipped through the first few pages. His eyes paused on familiar lines, then moved down to the timelines. His expression shifted rapidly, from focused to cold. Cole continued, leaving no room for hesitation. If he is detained, I am the one who signed the final confirmation. I am the one who will take the blame. The words fell into the narrow corridor, echoing back in heavy silence. Ellen Moore read further. Indirect emails, unsigned directives, schedule adjustments labeled as optimization. He looked up at Cole. You know what this means? Cole nodded. I do. He turned toward Thomas, who was standing between two security officers. Cole stepped forward one pace, his voice lower. I was wrong. No justification. No detours. Thomas looked at him, his expression unchanged. He gave a slight nod, as if accepting something long overdue but necessary. The security officer looked at Ellen Moore, waiting for orders. Ellen Moore raised his hand, signaling a pause. He turned to a communications officer standing nearby. Call them in, here on base. The officer hesitated for a moment. Colonel, Ellen Moore repeated, his voice firm. Now, the order went out. A chain of calls began, fast and efficient. The news was triggered before anyone could stop it. Cole took a deep breath. He knew he had just crossed a line with no return. A legal officer stepped forward, his voice tight. This is escalation, Cole replied. Yes, and I am putting my name on it. Ellen Moore turned to legal. Halt all procedures, he said, each word clear. All of them. Legal looked around, then nodded, like someone who had just realized there was no safe exit left. The corridor, once quiet, began to stir. Phones vibrated constantly. Brief questions were asked, then cut short by stop orders. The system wobbled for the first time, not because of an attack, but because one link had refused to play its silent role. Thomas was removed from the escort perimeter. The security officers stepped back half a pace, maintaining a neutral posture. Cole stood beside Thomas, saying nothing further. Ellen Moore stepped closer, lowering his voice. Are you all right? Thomas answered. I am. He looked around, meeting the eyes of those who had just witnessed it. There was no applause, only the tension of people who understood that everything had just shifted. The media arrived faster than expected. A small group was brought into an emergency briefing room, and recording equipment was set up. Ellen Moore stood before the microphones, not reading from a prepared statement. He spoke briefly about suspending procedures, about the need for transparency. Cole stood beside him, looking straight into the camera when questioned. Are you afraid of the consequences? Cole replied, his voice calmer than he felt. I am more afraid of silence. Breaking news spread beyond the base through channels that could not be recalled. Calls from higher command poured in, rapid and relentless. Ellen Moore listened, responded, and cut them short. He knew the counterattack would come, but it had lost its timing. Some directives were withdrawn. Some meetings were postponed. Somewhere, someone realized the game was no longer airtight. In the coordination room, a screen displayed a status change. The transfer schedule was suspended. The final signature was no longer pending. Cole looked at that space and realized he had just broken the chain. There was no shield, no system standing behind him, only the truth, held under the light long enough that it could not be stuffed back into a file. Ellen Moore took a call and listened in silence. He replied briefly. I stopped it. Then he hung up. He turned to Cole. You understand what this will lead to? Cole nodded. I understand. Ellen Moore looked at Thomas. You as well. Thomas replied. I understood long ago. Outside, hurried footsteps moved back and forth. Doors opened and closed. One internal notice was withdrawn. Another directive was rewritten in more cautious language. At a higher level, a name began to disappear from exchanges. No announcement, no rebuttal, just withdrawal. The breaking news continued to spread. Questions were asked. Trails were followed. Victor Hale did not appear, did not respond. His influence faded within the chain of directives, like traces hastily erased upon realizing the lights had been turned on. No apology, no dialogue, only tactical silence. Ellen Moore stood by the window, looking out at the runway. Thomas stood beside him, silent. Cole stood behind them, shoulders heavy, but straight. The system had just wavered, and in that moment of imbalance, a truth had risen to the surface, not enough to end everything, but enough to change the trajectory. Breaking news spread beyond the base. Victor Hale withdrew in silence. The conference room at Gray Mesa was emptier than usual. No screens were powered on. No flags or presentation charts, just a room sealed tightly enough that words would not leak out, and bare enough that no one could hide behind ceremony. Ryan Cole stood at the head of the table, his hand resting on the cold wooden surface, looking toward Thomas Ward, seated opposite him. No rank insignia, no documents, no observers. This meeting was not on any official schedule. Cole took a breath, then spoke directly. I am not asking for forgiveness. The sentence left his mouth cleanly, without probing for a reaction. He continued, his voice lower. I just do not want to keep being a coward. The final words fell without cushioning, without a safe way of saying them. Thomas looked at Cole for a long time. That gaze carried neither judgment nor indulgence. It resembled the look of someone who had once stood on a runway, watching a young pilot perform a final check before a first flight. No one knew how that flight would end, but some things needed to be said before takeoff. Thomas placed his hand on the table, his voice slow and clear. Systems do not collapse because of bad people. He paused, giving the words time to reach the person across from him. They collapse because good people choose silence. Cole swallowed, but did not look away. Thomas continued, his tone unchanged. Today, you chose differently. Outside the room, Gray Mesa returned to its familiar operational rhythm. No alarms, no escorts. Meetings were rescheduled, documents rewritten in more cautious language. A few names disappeared from email chains. No one declared victory, because there was no victory complete enough to declare. Ellen Moore stood in the corridor, looking through the glass toward the runway. The Aten lay still, not dismantled, not yet transported anywhere. He knew the decision to keep it was only temporary. Systems do not change overnight, but small changes, when placed correctly, make it impossible for everything to return to its previous state. In the reports sent upward, the wording was chosen carefully. Temporarily suspended for review. Additional independent assessment required. Process transparency requested. No one wrote that a truth had escaped, but everyone read it between the lines. Ryan Cole left the conference room after Thomas. The hallway was long, the lights casting his shadow trailing behind him. He knew what awaited him. No more straight-lined advancement. No more protective cover from the system. Every decision from now on would be scrutinized more closely. But for the first time, he felt himself standing upright in his own role, not occupying a borrowed position meant only for signing his name. Thomas stepped outside and stopped on the steps. The desert wind blew lightly, carrying the smell of metal and dust. He looked back toward Gray Mesa, a place built to handle the past neatly. It was no longer innocent, not because it had become evil, but because it could no longer pretend not to know. Ellen Moore approached. What will you do next? Thomas answered without hesitation. Stay until the truth can stand on its own. Ellen Moore nodded. That will not be easy. Thomas gave a slight smile. It never is. Outside, the news gradually died down. There was no immediate public hearing. No one was led away in handcuffs before cameras. Victor Hale did not appear to rebut anything, nor did he issue a correction. His withdrawal followed a familiar pattern, quiet, leaving no surface for anyone to grasp. But the chain had been broken, and once a chain breaks, it cannot be reconnected in the same way. In the days that followed, Gray Mesa continued to be mentioned in closed-door meetings, no longer as a final transit point, but as a lesson in what happens when a system grows too confident in silence. A few other bases began reviewing similar procedures, not out of idealism, but out of fear of being exposed to the light. Ryan Cole received a notice of temporary reassignment. No promotion, no public discipline, a state of suspension, enough to remind him that every choice carries a cost. He read the notice, folded it, and put it away. That cost, to him, was acceptable. Thomas Ward returned to the hangar. Walking past the dust-covered A-10s, he placed his hand on the aircraft's body, feeling the cool metal. He did not say goodbye. These machines had not finished their role, and even if they had, the truth about them had been spoken enough to ensure it would not be buried again. Gray Mesa fell silent once more, but this silence was different. It is no longer concealed. It waited, waiting for the next questions, in other places, under other names, because out there are still systems that believe proper procedure is enough, and still people standing before a choice between personal safety and the truth. If you believe the truth does not need permission, leave a comment saying break the chain, because out there are still other Gray Mesas. Gray Mesa closed one chapter, but the story did not end. There were no handcuffs before cameras, no cheers from victors, only a chain that had been broken, and a truth that escaped in time before being permanently sealed. The system did not collapse overnight, but from that moment on, it no longer operated in the shadows as it once had. What happened at Gray Mesa was not an exception. It was simply a clear enough example to remind us that the most dangerous power is power that does not need to appear, and that silence is sometimes not neutral, but complicit. Thomas Ward did not achieve a complete victory, neither did Ryan Cole, but they chose to stand on the side of the truth at the exact moment when most people chose to turn away. If this story made you pause and think, if you have ever found yourself facing a similar choice, follow and subscribe to the channel, not to seek easy hero stories, but to continue peeling back what is hidden behind procedures that seem harmless. Out there are still many gray mesas, and the truth survives only when someone is willing to look directly at it.